Hello there, and welcome to the Lawless Time Policy Update lesson. Today we're going to go over both the policy documents, covering what has changed, and what that means for the game. We have more changes to the policy documents this time than we did with the comprehensive rules, but the changes to the comprehensive event guide are much smaller than they were last set. Because of the scope of the Secrets of Power overhaul, there were a ton of small grammatical and formatting errors, but you don't really need to know where commas have been added or removed, as they don't meaningfully change the document. We're just going to go through these in order and then tie things together as it makes sense to do so. We've added some new lines here and there to provide more structure and to clarify questions people had after reviewing the updated documents. Starting with Section 3 of the Tournament Regulations, Roles and Responsibilities. Before the Comprehensive Event Guide, there was a hygiene infraction that was removed with the launch of the CEG. There's now language in player responsibilities that say players need to be aware of their personal presentation to not negatively impact other participants. Similarly, TOs can remove players who are negatively impacting the play environment. In Section 4, Material Legality, we have a note on large-scale limited events. The Comprehensive Event Guide was developed before the first large-scale limited events, and so the document had several gaps in that regard, which are covered by the Lawless Time update. Here, there's clarification that cards stamped for use in official drafts can be used in other events, despite the markings potentially partially obscuring card information. Section 5.9, under Tournament Concepts and Mechanics, sees some clarification for events that utilized open deck lists. Competitive and Master Tier constructed events should continue to use them in the top cut, and limited events of those tiers should use open pool lists in the top cut. It also clarifies that some events may use open deck lists during the Swiss rounds, but currently no events are mandated to do so. Moving on to the competitive policy guide, starting with Section 3, Gameplay Disruptions, we have some language around the optional or missable abilities, and it has been revised and expanded. It previously included all abilities with may or up to, which was too broad as it made triggers that had non-optional components like Ezra Bridger, Resourceful Troublemaker, be treated as though the whole ability were optional. It also allowed players to avoid pointing out their own triggers that their opponents should have had the opportunity to make a choice on. Previously, it read, quote, "Some abilities includes the phrase may or up to. These abilities are optional and do not have to be resolved, and a player does not have to remind their opponent of these abilities," end quote. Now the text is a bit more complicated. Some effects use phrases like may or up to without an if you don't clause, indicating that those parts of the effect are optional and do not need to be performed. A player does not have to remind their opponent of these optional choices, except when the decision is made by a player who does not control the effect. That is to say, abilities that say may or up to are optional, and players don't have to remind their opponents unless it meets one of three conditions. 1. The trigger has a default resolution, like on Warrior of Clan Ordo, which says, if you don't. 2. They control the effect and their opponent is making the choice, such as on Stolen AT Hauler or Bounty abilities. 3. There are other effects that are not covered by the phrase may or up to in the ability, which usually precede the choice, as on Ezra. Now, moving on to Section 3.3, Hidden Card Manipulation Error, we have some refinement of policy. The first is a paragraph added for when a player is supposed to reveal a card but doesn't. For example, a player searches the top 8 cards of their deck for an upgrade and puts it into their hand, but don't reveal it. The opponent isn't able to verify this information. However, by using the HCME fix, we can have the player reveal their hand and allow the opponent to choose which cards were selected for the search effect. If they match the requirements and are, say, in this case, an upgrade, the game continues. If they don't, those selected cards are combined with the rest of the original set of cards that was searched, likely on the bottom of the deck, and the effect is resolved anew on this combined set. This mitigates the potential advantage for a player sneaking in a card that didn't meet the criteria into their hand by allowing the opponent to remove it. However, if the search was, say, for a unit and all cards in hand are units, then it effectively reveals to the opponent that the search was legal, but doesn't further distress the game. This sort of fix does put the player who committed the error on the back foot and disrupts the organic outcome of the game, but drastically less so than if players were able to resolve searches and other similar effects illegally. HCME also has a new example, where a player draws extra cards while drawing their opening hand. This leads directly into section 3.4, where mulligan error has been reworked. Rather than being any error during opening hands, it's specifically taking a mulligan when not allowed to. Drawing too many cards has been moved to HCME, and drawing too few cards or mulligan early are not infractions. However, taking a second mulligan or waiting for the non-active player to make a choice before making your own as an active player is not allowed and extremely disruptive. A potential fix is to utilize a fix akin to the HCME fix, but allowing a player to craft their opponent's opening hand with no possibility of mulligan is effectively a game loss, and so the penalty is now just a game loss for all mulligan errors. Moving into section 4, we have our event disruptions. Starting with section 4.2, deck error, there's a new example for players unwittingly playing with counterfeit cards as another example of illegal cards. Later on, there's going to be an example for players knowingly playing with counterfeit cards, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Section 4.3, deckless error, looks like it has a lot of changes, but it's really just moving text from one place to another. There are, however, a couple of additions for limited events. First, if a player's deck list is missing cards, rather than adding cards randomly from the sideboard or the rest of the pool, they are added randomly from the rest of the pool from the cards that match the registered leader and base first. If we run out of those cards, then it'll be randomly from the rest of the pool. Second, a new downgrade clause has been added. If a leader and base are not registered in a limited list and there's only one possible combination, the penalty can be downgraded to a warning. For example, if a player registers Cunning, Command, and Heroism cards and not really anything else, and has one Cunning Heroism leader and no Command Heroism leaders, it can be safely assumed that the player intended to register the Cunning Heroism leader and the Common Command base. If there are two different eligible leaders, even if one mechanically makes more sense than the other, or if there's a rare base in the pool of the appropriate aspects, the downgrade doesn't apply. Section 4.5, slow play, has a quick clarification that play more quickly reminders come with tracking penalties instead of warnings. Reminders aren't infractions and so don't come with a penalty that upgrades. It also has a bit more remedy in the remedy section. When slow play is issued, players should receive one more action phase during overtime procedures, in addition to the one allotted to all players. This helps balance out the time available to the player who is disadvantaged by their opponent's more methodical pace of play. Then we move to section 5, unsporting conduct. Unsporting conduct sees several clarifications and refinements, most of which provide further information around determining match outcomes. We will cover those as a batch, but first a few quick hits. Unsporting conduct insulting behavior gets the same upgrade as USC minor if it happens on an officially recorded match, and is upgraded immediately to a match loss. Furthermore, as a parallel to the example in section 4.2 deck error, in section 5.7 cheating, there's a new example as well. A player who is playing counterfeit cards, knows that they're not authentic, and knows that they're not allowed to do so, is cheating. And then we get to the rules regarding determining match outcomes. The policy seen in sections 5.5 and 5.6, illegally determining results and bribery, collusion, and gambling, has some more explicit clarification on what is and is not allowed. It is reinforced that players are allowed to discuss the game state, including both open and game information, and can reveal hidden information that they have access to. They can use this information to make a decision, but cannot ask their opponent to concede, and asking for a concession is attempting collusion. However, there's a new downgrade which is very important. If a player asks for a concession and is unaware against the rules that say you're not allowed to ask for a concession, they receive a match loss instead of being disqualified. However, that is only applicable if there was no other offer or additional conversation regarding the matchcome, only a player asking for their opponent to concede. And that's it. Thank you so much for joining us, and I encourage you to take the Lawless Time Mastery Quiz after you've looked at the rules update. The quiz is, of course, not required, but it's a good way to make sure that you're up to date with the new rules, mechanics, and policy. You can find more details about Mastery Quizzes on nexus.cascadegames.com/exams/mastery. Until next time, good luck and have fun.